Hello, Chris McMeeking with Mobley here today to talk about how iOS assistive technologies work. I have been working on a couple of videos this weekend that are going to work together in tandem to kind of start introducing the complexity that I have been alluding to in the overall ecosystem and in the need for a set of guidelines to help push everything forward in terms of getting more accessible applications out there in the ecosystem, particularly applications that are accessible across a broad range of devices, not just for VoiceOver users. In order to get there, we need to talk about how iOS assistive technologies work. About Mobley, my name is Chris McMeeking. I'm a native mobile accessibility engineer and have been since mobile was just kind of becoming popular. See the intro video to this channel for more information on my background. I am on a mission to post a video every day leading up to Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which I will actually be speaking at. Just formally arranged that with the Bay Area Accessibility Meetup. I think it is. Really looking forward to it, and we'll post about that on my LinkedIn. Around GAD, I plan to publish an iOS and Android interpretation of WCAG, respectively, which I am now pretty sure I'm going to call MOBAG, M-O-B-A-G. The videos leading up to this are meant to inform why such an interpretation is necessary. And like I said, today is the first time I'm going to dig into a little bit of detail on the complexity and why it exists. iOS video schedule. So far, we have covered the introduction to mobile accessibility, an introduction to VoiceOver, the tools that allow users with sight impairments, not just blindness, to get audible information from elements on screen without needing to see the screen to do so. And today, we're going to cover how iOS assistive technologies work. All right, so how iOS assistive technologies work. So in order to cover this, here's the different kind of topics that we're going to talk about. How applications communicate with assistive technologies. We'll go over an example involving a basic login screen and how VoiceOver, quote, sees it, and how this information gets passed from the application to screen readers. Second, we'll go over a concept from WCAG, a name, role, value, reinterpreted for native iOS a little bit. If you're curious about this, Google Understanding Success Criteria 4.1.2. You will find all sorts of information really quickly, and we'll talk about how this applies to native mobile operating systems. Finally, why using accessibility APIs in their intended way is so important. With a defense of MOBAG preview and my first major defense of the need for it. All right, so how applications communicate with assistive technologies. First, application renders content through implementations of a UI view, right? UI views are the base view object in iOS, and they have various concrete implementations, UI button, UI text field, UI label. All of these things are inheriting features from UI view. All UI views share similar properties and behaviors, including their ability to have a textual representation sent to an assistive technology. All UI views can take various pieces of their properties, particularly ones that make sense to be serialized in a plain text form, and send that information off in a packet to an assistive technology. We will refer to this textual layer as the accessibility API. There are artifacts and pieces of Apple's accessibility API that do more than just this textual information of singular views back and forth. But for the purposes of today, we're just going to talk about discrete rendered views and how those views translate their information in a version that can be utilized by various assistive technologies. The assistive technology takes and presents this to the user in its own way. Let's look at an example and dive in. All right, so first off, we have to go from the rendered view to this accessibility API, which in iOS, we're going to call the UI accessibility element. This is a protocol that is implemented on all UI views. And it is the protocol that iOS used to communicate back and forth between the application and assistive technology. So how do we go from rendering to accessibility API? So I have this screen here, just a basic login screen, a quick mock-up. We have a login screen at the top as the view controller title. And we have two text fields here labeled with username and password respectively. I have my Chris CM 2006 thing filling in the username as if I had started filling this out, and the password is empty. And then at the bottom, I have a sign in button. And right now I have this red box around the sign in button because I want to focus on this particular piece, right? We have 4 different controls, or 6, depending on how you mock this up. We have 4 different focusable voiceover zones here in the ideal setup. And we have this button. We're going to follow, let's follow the information about a button, right? So we have a UI view, class name UI button. In this case, this would just be a UI button up here. I am separating this information because when we're talking about what the UI accessibility element protocol is going to transfer, this textual layer, we're not actually going to have access to a UI button within the assistive technology, but we may know about its class, or we may know other properties. This is one of the things that's a little weird about the way Apple's accessibility APIs work, is there's a public layer, but there also may be things, in fact, I heavily suspect there are things going on in private, and that is something that we will cover in more detail tomorrow. But for now, let's follow a couple of pieces of information that we do know where they come from. We have the UI view, and like I said, this is a UI button, so this element would just be like new UI button or something like that, depending on your language, and text sign in. The text gets translated into the UI accessibility protocol as the accessibility label. This is done by default. You don't have to worry about it. It may also, like I said, in that private sense, come through as text somewhere else within the accessibility API that we're not aware of. But this automatic translation from sign in to accessibility label makes sense in this case because it's the name of the control. The accessibility trait is button. This comes from some default things that happen within UI buttons. In fact, I'm not even sure if this is something that happens anymore, but obviously the accessibility trait of button is something that we would expect, whether it's a default property or not. It's certainly something that's going to get checked virtually every time we drop it in a storyboard, but I do think it's a default in this case, coming from the fact that we have constructed a UI button, and obviously it should have the button trait. There's also some private, like I said, some private information that I suspect gets exchanged back and forth, particularly regarding the existence of touch-up inside gestures. Why that is speculative, we can talk about more tomorrow when we talk about assistive technologies other than VoiceOver. All right, so once we have this rendering go to the accessibility layer, VoiceOver can take a hold of that information and translate it for the user in the form of an announcement, right? So from rendering to VoiceOver through the accessibility API, right? We have this sign in button, accessibility label sign in, accessibility trait button. As a VoiceOver user, when I focus this thing, I hear sign in button, right? We take those 2 bits of information and we combine them into announcement, and this comma and this pause and any pausing comes from the operating system, right? This announcement is structured and put together from the individual pieces of information, and that's really important. And we'll get to more of that when we talk about effective VoiceOver testing. But when we're talking about how assistive technologies work, we go from a rendering, sign in button here, over here to the left. We serialize it in terms of textual properties. We have an accessibility label sign in, and we have the trait of button, and then a VoiceOver user hears sign in button, and maybe some other things coming from the actionability or the accessibility hint. But in this case, we just have a simple sign in button. And here's how a VoiceOver may see the entirety of this screen, right? This is going on for all of these objects in the screen. They all have their own combinations of these properties of accessibility label, of accessibility trait, and like I said, of some information that perhaps is hidden to us. There is no, for example, text field trait. This is coming from private information within the accessibility API. So as a VoiceOver user, the way I would hear this screen is my first focus target would be the title at the top, login screen. Maybe we mark it up as a heading, maybe we don't. In this case, we decided not to, and that's okay. The second focus was username text field Chris CM 2006. Remember, I told you that I put that Chris CM 2006. I've been entering stuff. Third, password text field empty. Notice the bold italics around the word empty. VoiceOver can decide how to communicate that empty in whatever way it wants. In fact, it may even be related to the text-to-speech engine and whenever the text-to-speech engine configuration has to say for whatever an empty string is. That's why we have that bold italics around it. And then finally, sign in button, right? And we have this kind of structure of information here where we have login screen, just a purely informative element, username, text field, Chris CM 2006, name, role, value. We have these different pieces of information coming from this kind of structured different parts of the accessibility API. And that's really important because different accessibility APIs may want to communicate that information differently, especially regarding the separation of name, role, and value of this subject, username. What does the thing do? It's a text field. You can put text in it. Chris CM 2006 is the current value, but maybe that will change. And this separation of subject, purpose, and value is something that matters for a lot of different controls and a lot of different assistive technologies in various ways for various reasons. The important thing is that they are separate and structured so that an assistive technology can, for example, in the event of changes of accessibility value, update the user on that without being too verbose and repeating the name and the purpose, right? Name, role, value, super, super important concept. All right, so let's talk a little bit about accessibility APIs. What we just looked at is how accessibility APIs communicate with assistive technologies. How does information go from being rendered on screen to being rendered by something like VoiceOver, Brailleback, or other assistive technologies? A separate accessibility API exists for several reasons. To restrict the capabilities of accessibility services for privacy and security, it would be very dangerous for accessibility services to have direct access to an application's memory to actually get the access to UI button and other objects within your application. This is not something that we want happening, right? So we have this serialization layer. The two processes can be separate, but they can communicate textual information about views back and forth. This is also a requirement from kind of user agent accessibility guidelines, where the general expectation is that these assistive technologies are working to present information or act on behalf of the user, and that a lot of the visual stuff and a lot of the other more complicated rendering things coming from this is not important. A simplified communication layer between the whatever assistive technology is actually preferred, because they can then, it encourages developers to have textual information that can make sense for assistive technology, especially on the sight impairment side of the equation, right? We present view information as serializable text in a way that is consistent and structured. The accessibility API wants to have a rhyme, reason, and structure to the information. That way, assistive technologies know what to do with different parts of that information. In the case of VoiceOver, for example, when we focus a control and the control's value changes, we will only hear updates to that control's value. So if you're on an adjustable control where you're trying to, let's say, increment some number of potatoes that you are purchasing, and you're swiping up on this adjustable control and it keeps counting up, you're not going to hear tomato 1, tomato 2, tomato 3. Tomato is the name of the thing. It's the accessibility label. You're just going to hear 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 every time you swipe up, because that is the accessibility value. And the separation of those two things is really important, because different assistive technologies may separate accessibility label and accessibility value in different ways that are particularly meaningful to individuals. For example, Braille board users. There may be a special Braille board that has the name of something on a portion of the Braille board and the label and the value of something on another portion, allowing a Braille board user who is familiar with the application to quickly find where they put their what is currently entered into a text field or something like that, right? This structuring of information allows assistive technology users to rely on a certain conveniences added by their assistive technologies, and separating that information is really important. The separation in related contracts and user expectations is a user agent accessibility guidelines concept, which we will cover in detail next in effective iOS accessibility testing with VoiceOver. One of the reasons that these are also important is Apple can most effectively evolve iOS to meet users' needs when their APIs are used consistently across all applications in the ecosystem, which brings us to the importance of WCAG 2.1 -4.1.2 name, role, and value. This is the success criteria where the importance of application developers sticking to that name, role, value, sticking to the purpose of accessibility label, accessibility value, accessibility traits, and accessibility hints, using those properties for their purposes is really important. And this is a 4.1.2 concept. WCAG 2.1 4.1.2 translated for iOS. This is a summary version. When we get to the publication of MobaAG, it won't really quite look like this. But if we wanted to do a direct translation of 4.1.2, this is approximately what it would sound like. Application developers must use UI accessibility element properties for their documented purpose. For example, accessibility labels, to provide alternative text for imagery, to present the subject of an active control. There's also a corner case use of accessibility labels when you have a purely informative control that you can group them together. At this point, we have essentially turned a parent control into an image, and it is an extension of the to provide alternative text for imagery. But grouping those things together is really positive, and what we want to do is just make sure that we have a function that is going to do that reliably, and then awesome. Grouping things together is a very powerful mobile accessibility technique. Accessibility value accessibility value should represent the modifiable portion of a control that can update a value, right? So when you're talking about a switch, let's say that we have a switch that turns the lights on and off. The accessibility label might be the lights, and the value might be on or off. In the case of iOS, a switch will take care of that for us, but this is the concept of accessibility label and accessibility value. Where do we put this information? Where does it belong? In the case of creating custom versions of that control, in reality, we just want to leave a UI switch alone and let it do its thing. Accessibility hint, clarifying information related to the purpose of the control. Accessibility hints have a little bit of a complex relationship with accessibility because they're so easy to turn on and off. You don't want to use them to store any crucial information, such as the name or the purpose of a thing, but they can be used to kind of give an extended description of the purpose, and that can help particularly VoiceOver users who are new to VoiceOver and learning how to absorb context from an iOS application. The motivation for 4.1.2. Assistive technologies should be able to present different pieces of information to users in ways that is meaningful to them, particularly regarding the separation of subject, purpose, and value. Also, consistency here allows Apple to release frequent updates to their platform with confidence. Apple is beholden to application developers just like they are customers, and they need to drive their platform forward, and they need to release new features, including new features for people with disabilities, while also having confidence that they're not breaking developers' applications in the process of doing so. And they can only do that if the APIs are used for their intended purpose. And that's why success criteria like WCAG 2.1, 4.1.2 are so important, and why this will be a concept that is visited heavily when we get to those native mobile accessibility guidelines, and how everything wants to be tested, and how we make sure that all of these properties are aligning and being used for their intended purposes. The need for MoBag. Apple gets this wrong too. That's the thing that is so difficult about the iOS ecosystem, is there isn't consistency, and not even consistency within Apple's own application. Into my next video, I will dive into effective iOS accessibility testing in relation to a very common abuse of Apple's accessibility APIs within Apple's own applications. This is not meant to attack Apple in any way. They are a leader in the accessibility space, especially mobile. Their operating system is simple and beautiful. This is only meant to underscore the complexity of coding native iOS applications for accessibility and the confusion that exists in the ecosystem. Even my retranslation of 4.1.2 for iOS leaves gaps in the testing process and does not adequately describe the pain users face when APIs are used incorrectly. MoBag will aim to alleviate this confusion by providing a set of guidelines wrapped in simple, purposeful statements that can in turn be used to guide the way in which each guideline is tested. And that wraps it up for today. Contact me if you have any comments or want to chat accessibility, reach out. If you have an idea for a video you'd like to see, comment. If you're interested, I'm still interested in feedback on setting up that Patreon account so that I can provide more content. Let me know if that is something that you would contribute to, or if you'd be willing to contribute to the content. Time, it's all the same. I just want to, I don't want to get into a position where the community is getting value from something that I end up not keeping up to date. And so that's the reach out here. Reach out to me on social networking, LinkedIn, ChrisCM2006, Twitter, ChrisCM2006, pretty much everything ChrisCM2006. You can find me out there, or Facebook, Chris McMeeking, the one with the cool car. Have a good day, everybody.